Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, today I'd like to thank Senator Kaine for joining with me in introducing what should hopefully be a simple but crucially important matter for the Senate to issue an unequivocal, direct, and clear condemnation of all forms of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, we're living in an era where the need for a strong and clear condemnation of anti-Semitism has become acute. We are in the midst of a wave of anti-Semitism seen both here in the United States and all over the world. In just the last few years, we have seen repeated anti-Semitic comments made publicly, including insinuations questioning the loyalty and the patriotism of American Jews. We've seen physical violence against Jews, including shootings in Jewish places of worship, such as the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and the Chabad in Poway. We've seen a wave of physical attacks against Jews in the streets of New York. And we have seen the growth on our college campuses of movements to aggressively boycott products made by Jews in Israel. And as we've learned this week, things have gotten so bad that the New York Times has announced it will simply stop running political cartoons in their international edition after being criticized and forced to apologize for recently running a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon. This resolution was also prompted, unfortunately, by the inability of the House of Representatives to come together and vote on a resolution straightforwardly and directly condemning anti-Semitism. Too many in political life have given in to the extremes, including the embrace of boycotts and at times outright hatred for Israel, the world's only Jewish state. So when the House tried to condemn anti-Semitism, sadly, they were instead forced to water it down into a general resolution decrying bigotry of all sorts, listing every group they could think of. There's, of course, nothing wrong with condemning bigotry and hatred in general, but anti-Semitism is a unique prejudice with a unique history that has led to unique horrors throughout history. Jews today are the most targeted religious group in the United States for hate crimes, according to the data compiled by the FBI. We need to be able to acknowledge that clearly and directly, and that's what this resolution does. This resolution outlines how ancient forms of anti-Semitism continue to live on today. It emphasizes that anti-Semitism is a unique form of prejudice stretching back millennia, and it condemns the modern form of those ancient prejudices. It talks about how anti-Semitism has for centuries included exactly what we're seeing here today, including physical attacks against Jews, including attacks on the loyalty of Jews and accusations of dual loyalty, campaigns to boycott, to confiscate, or destroy Jewish businesses, and accusations that Jews use money to purchase political power. These are all false and vicious slurs. This resolution also speaks to the unique prejudice Jews here in America experience, which we must acknowledge. I'd like to read one clause in particular in the resolution, quote, "In the United States, Jews have suffered from systematic discrimination in the form of exclusion from home ownership in certain neighborhoods, prohibition from staying in certain hotels, restrictions upon membership in private clubs and other associations, limitations upon admission to certain educational institutions, and other barriers to equal justice under the law." This is a shameful legacy, and it makes it all the more incumbent that we as a Senate speak in one voice and stand resolved that the United States condemns and commits to combating all forms of anti-Semitism. Mr. President, this bipartisan resolution has 56 co-sponsors, including 14 Democratic senators. I am particularly grateful to Senator Kaine and his leadership, which has been pivotal in bringing us together to speak united with one clear voice. And I'm hopeful that just moments from now, the Senate will come together, will pass a clear denunciation of anti-Semitism 100-0, so that we are clearly understood and clearly heard. With that, I yield to my friend, Senator Kaine.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I applaud my colleague for reaching out to see if we could work together on this important resolution, a resolution that coming to the Senate in 2013, as did my colleague, neither of us believed we would need to stand on the floor of this body to introduce. In August of 2017, students and their families had just arrived in the town of Charlottesville to move into the University of Virginia. A close friend of mine, Rabbi Jake Rubin, is the Hillel rabbi at the University of Virginia. And the students and their families, many were coming to Charlottesville over Virginia for the first time, excited to begin their college career, gathered with other Hillel students and families on campus on a Friday, together with members of the Charlottesville Jewish community, to fellowship and worship. Soon they heard chants outside of the place where they were worshiping, and they saw individuals dressed in a sort of a uniform of khaki pants and white shirts, carrying torches and marching. They were marching at something that was a two-day rally billed as a Unite the Right rally. But it was the words that were coming out of the marchers' mouths that terrified these worshipers and students, because what they were chanting were slogans from Nazi youth rallies from the 1930s. Jews will not replace us, blood and soil, other horrible and chilling statements that terrified these young people and the adults who were with them. In the next day, this rally/riot continued. White supremacists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates. An individual in a vehicle ran his car into a crowd, injuring many and killing Heather Heyer, a paralegal from the Charlottesville area. Two state troopers, both of whom I knew because they were part of the governor's security detail during my tenure as governor and also the tenure of then Governor McAuliffe, who were patrolling to try to provide order in a difficult situation, and their helicopter went down and both of them were killed trying to protect public safety. We didn't think that would happen in Virginia. We didn't think that would happen in the hometown of an archetypal American political leader who believed that the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of religion was one of the most important things about our country, that you can worship as you like or not and not be preferred or punished for the choice that you make. And yet it did happen, Virginia. It did happen in our country. This day was a day that extended a long history, as my colleague mentioned, of anti-Semitism in the country. Lynchings, the Leo Frank lynching in Atlanta, Georgia in the early 1900s. Jews wrongly accused of crimes and then killed, crimes that they didn't commit. American boycotts of Jewish businesses in Michigan in the 1930s, restrictive covenants that prohibited Jews from moving into certain neighborhoods, restrictions on access to country clubs, educational institutions, bars that made it difficult to become members of certain professions. And even in addition to formal restrictions, a culture of intolerance, a culture of segregation that treated Jews as not fully equal in this land of equality. I had hoped that those days were behind us. But it's not just Charlottesville. There's a Jewish day school, the Gesher Day School, a few miles from here in Virginia, that experienced bomb threats in 2017 and 2018. The Jewish Community Center in Fairfax, Virginia has been repeatedly defaced with Nazi graffiti and anti-Semitic graffiti, and in a heartening sign when that happens, the faith communities of Virginia, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Baha'i, gather to scrub the graffiti off, and yet this hasn't happened just once. It happens over and over and over again. The shootings at the synagogue in Pittsburgh in California, the assassination of Jewish senior citizens at a senior center in Overland Park, Kansas, near where my parents live. The uptick in reported hate crimes against Jews, as my colleague mentioned, the biggest source of victims of hate crimes directed against any religion in this country are directed against Jewish Americans. And so we stand at a time where, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of who perpetrates it, we have to acknowledge that it's real, that it's dangerous, that it's growing, and those of us in leadership positions have to be able to stand against it as firmly as we can. And so I applaud my colleague for reaching out to see if we could work on this together. This is a topic that could be used for partisanship, that one side could point at things that folks on the other side said that they didn't like, and Senator Cruz and I talked about that, but what we realized is this is just too important an issue to get it bogged down in partisan politics, that the clear and present danger felt by members of the Jewish community and the escalating rhetoric against Jews in many parts of the country and around the world is something that would call for a bipartisan response, a clear condemnation, and also a Senate commitment that as a Senate we will do all that we can to combat anti-Semitism so that we can be true to the equality principle that's our nation's North Star, so that we can be true to the freedom of religious worship that is enshrined in the First Amendment, and it's in the First Amendment for a very important reason. And so I applaud my colleague, and I hope it is the pleasure of this body to accept the motion that he will soon make, that by unanimous consent we pass this strong statement of where the Senate is on this most important topic. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor back to my colleague from Texas.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Virginia for his powerful and eloquent remarks decrying anti-Semitism and imploring all of us to stand united with one clear bipartisan voice, Democrats and Republicans all on the same page, 100-0, saying anti-Semitism has no place in the United States of America. With that, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration and the Senate now proceed to S-Res 189.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 189, condemning all forms of anti-Semitism.
With no objection to proceeding to the measure, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
to object. Do your talking points.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that, Mr. President, I'm in a quorum call.
We are.
Quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Rules Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-1562 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, and that the Warner substitute at the desk be agreed to, that the bill as amended be considered, read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Tennessee.
And I will object.
Objection served.
Mr. President, I'm deeply disappointed that the majority has rejected this request before I can even lay out why I think it's needed. My request was for me to take up and pass the Fire Act, S-1562, as amended. This legislation, pretty simple, even for this body, would require any presidential campaign that receives offers of assistance from an agent of a foreign government has an obligation to report that offer of assistance to law enforcement, specifically the FBI. Remember, our laws already prohibit campaign assistance from foreign governments. Let's take a moment and decide how we got here. And I want to lay out a little bit of the history, and then I'm going to ask the minority leader to make a couple of his comments, and then I would like to come back and finish my statement. But before I turn to the minority leader, let me refresh my colleague on the other side and others how we got here. In 2016, Russia and its agents intervened in our presidential elections, breaking into personal files, attempting to hack into our voting system, and used Facebook and Twitter to create fake accounts to splinter our country. During the campaign, then-candidate Trump publicly called on Russia that if they had any damaging information on then-candidate Clinton, that they should release it. And remarkably, that very same day was the first day when Russia started to dribble out its damaging information. Mr. President, the unanimous consensus of the entire American intelligence community, the Mueller investigation, and the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, of which I'm proud to be vice chairman, all have stated that Russia massively intervened in our elections, and they did so with an attempt to help then-candidate Trump and hurt candidate Clinton. President Trump's own FBI director and his director of national intelligence have said that Russia or others will likely be back in 2020 because their tactics in 2016 were both cheap and effective. We're now 17 months before the 2020 election. I personally believe we are not prepared. This body needs to take up bipartisan election security legislation to ensure that there's a paper ballot trail after all of voting in America so Americans can have trust that the integrity of their votes will be counted. We need to work together. I know there are many working on this issue to put some guardrails on our social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google so they're not as easily manipulated by foreign agents to create fake accounts. But unfortunately, this White House and this president still doesn't seem to appreciate the seriousness of the threat. Mr. Trump continues to undermine the Mueller report. Matter of fact, he has been reported he won't even convene a cabinet meeting on election security. his Homeland Security Secretary was told not to have that meeting because it might offend the president. And against the advice of his own FBI director, who said just in the last 2 weeks, he said yesterday, and even in a world where we've gotten used to outrageous statements coming from the White House, he said yesterday he might not report and he would maybe even welcome Russia or China or other bad actors if they again offered him assistance in the next campaign.
Colleague, yield for a
Yes,
minute.
I would yield.
First, I want to thank my friend from Virginia for offering this unanimous consent request and express my severe disappointment in our friends on the Republican side blocking it. The bottom line is very simple. When a president feels it's more important to win an election than conduct a fair election, we're a step further away from democracy and towards autocracy. That's what dictators believe. Winning at all costs. That seems to be what President Trump said yesterday. And the shame of this is that our Republican colleagues can't even bring themselves to say that when a foreign nation tries to interfere in our election, it ought to be reported to the FBI. How minimal. How minimal. And how disgraceful it is that our Republican friends cower before this president when they know that the things he does severely damage democracy. This one is a new low. It's okay for foreign powers to interfere, and we don't have to report it to law enforcement. That's welcoming foreign powers to interfere. And as my friend from Virginia said, the president's own FBI director said it's going to get worse in 2020. But let's cover it up, because it might have an effect that we like, say our Republican friends. Today is a new low for this Senate, for this Republican Party here in the Senate, and for this democracy. I would urge my friends when they go home over the weekend, my friends on the other side of the aisle, to rethink this. We will offer this unanimous consent request again. To say that it is okay to interfere, that we shouldn't have any law enforcement, that we should have no knowledge, is to encourage Russia, China, North Korea, Iran to interfere in our elections with no recourse. Shame. Shame. It is truly outrageous that this unanimous consent request, which should bring all of us together, is being blocked by our Republican friends. I yield back to my colleague, thank him for his wise unanimous consent request.
I thank my friend, the senator from New York, the minority leader. And I agree with him. And this is a really unfortunate time. I can't imagine. I always thought in today's political environment, you always think yesterday is going to be the greatest outrage. But the fact that yesterday the President of the United States said, even after all that we've gone through in the last 2.5 years, even after all of the evidence of Russian intervention has been out and vetted, even after 140 contacts between Russian officials and folks affiliated with the Trump campaign or Trump business operations, you think there would be a sense of some level of moral obligation, even if we're not backwards looking, to say on a going forward basis, we ought to make clear that if any foreign power tries to intervene again in an election, the least we can do is ask for a requirement to report to law enforcement. I heard yesterday the president went on and kind of said, oh, this is no big thing, or everybody does it. No, Mr. President, everybody doesn't do it. presiding officer who just left, he's run for president before. I have no question in my mind that if a foreign power tried to intervene in his campaign, he would have reported it to law enforcement. Every evidence in the past of attempts on foreign intervention, candidates have stepped up, doesn't matter what party they are, and did the right thing and report to law enforcement. A lot of my colleagues on the other side have said they don't want to relitigate 2016. There will be other times and places to further litigate whatever happened in 2016. In terms of today, I don't want to either. I just want to make sure that we are safe from foreign intervention in 2020. The remarkable thing is, we live in a world that post 9/11 has been dramatically changed in a whole host of ways. We have a whole series of new, appropriately so, security at our airports. And the mantra at our airports that TSA and Homeland Security always tries to promote is, if you see something, say something. Not an undue burden, I think, on our traveling public. And because of that involvement, I think our airports are safer. Shouldn't we have the same de minimis standard to protect the integrity of our election system? If you see something, say something. All my legislation is requiring is that if there is indications that agents of foreign government are trying to intervene in our elections, tell law enforcement, tell the FBI. Try to draft my legislation in ways to make sure that it wouldn't involve any of our activities in an official sense, so it wouldn't involve dealing at an embassy party, wouldn't involve in contacts in the normal course. And if there, let me state, for my friends on the other side, if there are ways to improve this legislation, to make sure that we could reach agreement on what I gotta believe, there's common agreement here, that we don't want foreign governments intervening in our presidential elections, I am wide open to how we can change this to make it better. But to say, in the face of this president's own FBI director, who has said it would be important that the FBI have this information about foreign intervention, and then to have the man sitting in the White House saying his own FBI director is wrong, well, I'd ask my colleagues, do you agree with Christopher Wray, the FBI director, about the importance of law enforcement seeing the evidence of foreign intervention, or do you believe it's not a big thing? Now, I'm anxious to hear the response from my colleague. And I know there may be questions raised. Well, what about the Steele dossier? That was somewhat a foreign intervention. Remarkable thing on the Steele dossier was that was reported to the FBI. It was given to the FBI in the summer of 2016. And if there are ways we can make sure on a going forward basis that any of those kind of, again, foreign-based activities are appropriately reported to law enforcement, let's have at it. But to say we don't think this is important enough, or that somehow this issue of the integrity of our election system shouldn't be debated, or shouldn't be taken up and put protections in place, is frankly astonishing to me. It's astonishing to me as well that 17 months out from this election, we have a White House where there's no one in charge of election security. That 17 months out from the next election, we've let sit fallow bipartisan election security legislation that would ensure that there is that paper trail and that there is that ability to audit the elections after the fact, so we can make sure that Americans have faith in the integrity of the vote. It's pretty remarkable to me that 17 months out from the next election, and 3 weeks after we've seen a manipulation of a video of the Speaker of the House that clearly was manipulated, that spread a false impression around the country, around the world, that we don't have common agreement on some basic rules of the road so that social media is not manipulated again in 2020 the way it was in 2016. And one only need to look at how social media's manipulation leads to hate and bloodshed in India and Burma and countries around the world. Not taking action on these items is the height of irresponsibility. And this most basic of all requirements, it simply says, if you see something, say something. If there's a foreign intervention, tell the FBI, let them make the judgment. Why would anyone say that is not necessary when we've seen recent history in our country, and for that matter, we've seen the same tactics Russia used in America, used in the Brexit vote, used in the French presidential elections. And again, I go back to DNI Director Coates, who said they'll be back. FBI Director Christopher Wray said they'll be back. They need this information. I hope that maybe after the weekend, that my colleagues on the other side will reconsider and take up this issue. I'll close with this. I just can't imagine, and I know some of my colleagues on the other side have already started to speak out, and I appreciate this. I appreciate him speaking out in a time when there is a huge fear of this White House and this president's willingness to take vendettas out against anyone who raises a voice in opposition. Think for a moment, think for just a moment about what Donald Trump said yesterday from the Oval Office. And a president's words from the Oval Office still carry weight. When the President of the United States said, well, everybody does this, so he'd take a look at assistance that might come from Russia or China or some other adversarial nation. My goodness gracious, the modern father of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, must be spinning in his grave. So, again, Mr. President, I'm not here to relitigate 2016. I'm here to make sure that we do our job, that we honor that oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, I don't know about you, but I would call the actions of Russia over the last few years the action of a foreign enemy. And we also have an obligation as well, Mr. President, to make sure that we protect the integrity of our election system. So let's take off our Republican Democratic hats for a few minutes. Let's go ahead and work together to pass election security legislation. Let's go ahead and pass some basic guardrails around social media so that we are not manipulated on future elections. And let's make sure and go ahead and put an obligation on all campaigns, presidential campaigns going forward, that if they see evidence of foreign intervention, that they report it appropriately to the FBI and law enforcement. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and would hope that there's a right, if my colleague from Tennessee is going to respond to some of my comments, to have a chance to respond to her comments as well.
See.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to articulate the reasons for the objection to the senator from Virginia's legislation. Let me begin by saying we are all for free and fair and honest elections. Now, I know the senator from Virginia spent some time as governor of Virginia. He knows that in 2016, no ballots, no one's vote was encumbered or affected. He knows that. I've served on an election commission. And I know that the senator from Virginia appreciates that our county election commissions and our state election commissions are in charge of securing those elections. And I will have to tell you, Mr. President, I know that in the great state of Tennessee, our county election commissions and our state election commission and our Secretary of State are very focused on making certain that these elections are fair and honest elections, and they're going to do that for all elections, local elections, state elections, and of course in the 2020 presidential election. A little bit of context, I think, is always helpful. First of all, let me say this. I welcome my colleagues across the aisle to the understanding that bad actors have tried for decades to influence what is going on in our government and in our country. Indeed, I remember as a child in 4-H Club, and Mr. President, I think that probably you were a member of 4-H Club when you were growing up. To me, as a young girl in South Mississippi, 4-H Club was a wonderful learning experience. It opened a lot of doors to me, and I recall sitting in a 4-H Club meeting at one point, and I was hearing about communism, and I was hearing about what the Russians and the communists wanted to do to our freedoms here in this country. And I can recall how frightened I felt when I heard that. So to my colleagues across the aisle who in 2016 realized that these bad actors, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, people that I call the new axis of evil, did not wish us well. I am so pleased to know that they have come to this realization that they indeed do not wish us well. And my hope is that in a bipartisan way, we can move forward and make certain that we do not allow these bad actors to in any way impede our freedoms or infringe on our government. Now, specific to the UC that was presented to us, this would require a presidential campaign and all employees to report their contacts with foreign nationals in which they discuss a contribution, donation, or expenditure such as an ad, or coordination, collaboration, providing information, providing services, or persistent and repeated contact with the government or a foreign country or an agent thereof. Now, this is what it all means. These reporting requirements are overbroad. Presidential campaigns would have to worry about disclosure at a variety of levels, so many different levels. Consider this: vendors that work for a campaign, people that are supplying some kind of good or service to a campaign. It would include those vendors, including all the service contracts. It would apply to door knockers. It would apply to phone bankers, down to any person who shares their views with a candidate. I want to be sure everybody hears that. Any person who shares their views with a candidate would be reportable. Think about that. Think about what that would cause. With this law, it would be prudent for every campaign contact to start with these words: before you tell me anything, are you a foreign national? We have the Foreign Agent Registration Act. Campaign finance law makes it illegal to take contributions or coordinate expenditures with foreign nationals without a green card. We have public official ethics laws. Campaigns could have to report social media responses or interactions, report every non-U.S. citizen, or even every dreamer. We hear a lot about the dreamers. So think about this. You would report every non-U.S. citizen or dreamer who volunteers for their campaign or knocks on doors or even knocks on the door of a foreign national. Every vendor contacts, every call center, every contract, every discussion, all of this, all of it would begin with, "Are you a foreign national?" So that is the overbroad nature of this. And while the goal is to make sure that never, ever, ever do we have a foreign government interfering, and we share that goal. It was wrong in 2016, it was wrong in 2018, it would be wrong in 2020. That's why we need to make certain that we do not have this kind of interference. No one wants foreign interference of any type in our government in any way, shape, or form. Now, to my friend across the aisle, we didn't like it when we heard former President Obama say to David Medvedev, "Tell Vladimir I'll have more flexibility after the election." We didn't appreciate that. We didn't appreciate it when the Clinton Foundation and Uranium One and all of that was transpiring back in 2015. We had questions about that. So do we want to make certain things such as that do not occur? Of course, of course. But the UC that was presented is overbroad, and this is something that should be done in a thoughtful way. It should be done in a bipartisan way, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
And see my friend, the chairman of the Finance Committee here, and I'll only take a couple of moments. One, I appreciate my colleague, Senator from Tennessee's comments that she agrees that we ought to make sure there's not foreign intervention in our elections. That ought to be a fairly easy thing to agree to. I would point out that her reading of my legislation is not accurate. The only thing that would have to be reported is if an agent of a foreign government or a foreign national offered something that was already prohibited. It's not foreign national wants to volunteer on a campaign. We've already laid out prohibited activities that violate the law. The only action reported would be those actions that are taken that are prohibited. And candidly, if and I will take my colleague at her word, if there are ways to improve on this legislation, I'm wide open for business. And I think in past elections, she's right, I've run for governor, and I know my friend the senator from Iowa has run for a lot of elections. I think most of us in this chamber would never think about taking help from a foreign government. So if there's ways to work better on, I welcome that. But we're only having this discussion or debate because in a lot of ways the rules of the game changed in 2016. A foreign power, Russia, caught our government, our political system, our companies totally off guard. They hacked into the Democratic National Committee and individuals' personal accounts. And I would remind the president that the very day that then candidate Trump said on national television during the campaign, if the Russians got dirt on Hillary, bring it on. It's the very first day that the intelligence community, the Mueller report, our bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee found out that the Russians actually took him at his word and started releasing information that day. I think the integrity of our election system is terribly important. Russians tried to penetrate 50 states. They got into 21 of them. And I think they could have changed totals if they wanted to. They chose not to that year And we've done better in 2018, but I think we can even do more, and again, only for states who want to take additional federal assistance. That has been the working arrangement with our colleagues from the other side. And I know very few folks that wouldn't say, with the ability to have systems hacked into that is much different today than it was 20 years ago, having that paper trail after the fact makes a lot of sense. So let's agree and work on that. And we have this whole new beast of social media companies out there, provide a lot of good, but we have seen in repeated ways that they can be manipulated. And what we saw in 2016, frankly, is going to pale in comparison with the advent of deep fakes and a series of other new technologies. So we got caught off guard. We should not be caught off guard in 2020. The reason we've got this legislation proposed and why it is so necessary is because the President of the United States yesterday, although I filed this legislation a month ago because I thought we needed to be absolutely clear going forward, but the immediacy of the unanimous consent request is because yesterday the President of the United States from the Oval Office said, oh, everybody in politics takes input from foreign governments. Left everybody with that impression. I don't. I absolutely believe the senator from Iowa doesn't. And he said, even after all that's happened in the last 2.5 years, if Russia or China or other countries might intervene again, he might take that information, take that assistance again. Our country is better than that, and our democracy is more important than its willingness to be traded away for short-term political gain of being in cahoots with a foreign power. Saying that's happened, but boy, oh boy, what an invitation was made yesterday to folks, the senator from Tennessee just indicated, don't wish us well. So if there are ways to improve on this legislation, I am wide open for that. But if we don't put in place an obligation that has to date been a moral obligation that I think we have all honored, if we don't put in place a legal obligation to make sure that if you see evidence of foreign intervention, you report it, shame on us. I'll close as I said. We do it at the airport. If you see something, say something. Shouldn't we have at least those same standards in terms of protection of our critical democracy going forward? With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I won't note the absence of the quorum if my friend from Iowa is going to speak. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President. I call my colleagues' attention to an issue that has affected many families in Iowa and throughout the country. That issue is elder abuse and neglect of those same people. Many older Americans reside in assisted care facilities, nursing homes, and all kinds of group living